the informal summit is all about? How is this different from a formal summit, and what is it that an informal summit can achieve that a formal summit cannot achieve?
To my mind, I think a summit should be more informal than formal. Because a formal summit is predicated really on a huge paraphernalia that is associated with it, whether it's protocol, whether it's just to do with the issues involved, the kind of agenda that you craft. An informal summit gives the leaders, the two interlocutors, the main interlocutors, the freedom perhaps to range across a number of issues, to dwell on some in more detail, and with a degree of freedom and less inhibition than you would associate with formal summits, where you have to go through the whole agenda, where you have the delegations sitting together, where communiques are drafted as outcomes. So I think this is more al fresco in many ways. But then you think of the Western summits, and then you think of a summit between India and China. This is a civilizational construct that you can give to it. Both are, from the east of the world. They represent Asia. They represent Asian values, and so the entire tenor of communication, I would presume, would be a little different from what it would mean if two Western leaders were meeting.
But there's a problem with the informal summit, right? If it is a formal summit, if it is sort of structured and the bureaucracies are deeply involved, you know what the outcome is going to be, or there are substantive outcomes, and those outcomes can be measured and can be taken forward. But in informal summit, the two leaders speak, and we don't know what the two leaders spoke to each other. And if that is the highest level of contact that we have, is that going to achieve anything at the end of the day?
My own impression is that even if the two leaders are speaking together, speaking to each other, and the others are not present, a certain degree debriefing does take place after the meeting. So each leader will obviously tell his or her senior official level representatives generally as to what transpired, what were the main points. So there is definitely a recording, a chronicling of what happened.
Right.
So it's not just that everything vanishes into ether. They meet and they go and they meet again, and nobody knows what really has transpired. That never happens.
But in any case, summits cannot replace the regular business of diplomacy, as it were.
No, they cannot replace the regular business of diplomacy. It's most essential that an informal summit of this nature infuses a certain degree of dynamism and energy and direction, most importantly, to the context, to the issues that are involved, and to the negotiations that are ongoing.
On the one hand, you are seeing a lot of warmth and friendship between the two leaders, as it were. On the other hand, you're also seeing China upping the ante on the Kashmir question and getting closer to Pakistan. And you call that a contradiction. How do we sort of resolve that contradiction, at least conceptually? What do you make of that contradiction? What explains that?
Well, it has a lot to do with China's own aspirations to big power status and placing itself in the Indian Ocean context, in the larger connectivity concept, where it's able to acquire places, if not bases, all over the region. And it has, in a sense, leveraged its long-standing relationship with Pakistan to do more of that, to essentially to work towards the fulfillment of some of these goals. So that becomes a contradiction for us, because although we are well aware that this relationship was extremely close and had a strategic component to it, the way it has come into the public space in the last couple of years definitely seems to suggest that China has, in a sense, moved away from taking an essentially non-involved approach to such issues as those that divide India and Pakistan, whether it's terror, whether it's Kashmir today. So what is this going to mean for the future is what we should ask ourselves.
Looking at Chinese behavior internationally, one gets the feeling that China looks at the international system in a very hierarchical sense of the term, as it were. Do you think China looks at India as a junior partner? How does China look at India? You were the Indian ambassador there. So
well, my own impression and my own takeaway is that China doesn't take India seriously enough. That is my view. I mean, in terms of what is the Chinese view of Indian democracy? Let's take that as one of the issues. Now, at the establishment level, the Chinese establishment level, I think the inclination and the emphasis is to suggest that, these are two countries, India and China, two civilizations that have taken two different political paths. And what has China got to show for it at the end of 70 years, and what has India got to show for it at the end of 70 years? And they take a very Sino-centric view about this, that Chinese communism and rule, single party rule has brought all this good to the Chinese people. Contrast it with what you see in India. And so they have a very slanted, selective take on the Indian democratic experiment. But that's different at the level of the people, because today you go to the microblogging sites in China, go to Sina Weibo, and the kind of comments you're getting, they are much more nuanced, much more, I think, well informed, and less prone to taking the establishment line. I mean, they see the good and the bad in Indian democracy, but they also see the good and the bad in the Chinese system.
Ambassador, in fact, after the visit to India, Xi Jinping visited Nepal, and this was actually the first visit by a Chinese leader to Nepal in 23 years. And in Kathmandu, Xi said, China will always support Nepal in safeguarding its national independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Is that pointing fingers at India at some level? Or you don't think so?
Well, it's certainly diplomatic doublespeak, I would say, and you can to some extent read between the lines on that, because there's no prizes for guessing that there are sections of Nepalese opinion that have a certain view of Indian policies towards Nepal and what happened, post-earthquake and during the so-called blockade. So there are certain injured sentiments there in Nepal, just to put it very mildly. There are political interests that would certainly like to, see this issue played out between two giants such as India and China, with Nepal in between. But let us not forget, and I was just reading a thread from Amitav Ghosh the other day, the author, where he speaks about how Nepal has been this kind of window for the Chinese into South Asia. Historically, I'm talking of the Qing Empire days. When the great game was very much in progression, and when the British were ruling in the waves and everything else beyond, and the Qing were beginning to sort of develop a perspective on looking at British expansionism and how to safeguard Chinese interests. And Nepal was a key player in that. So it's not just now that the Chinese are looking at Nepal. I mean, we know the history of Sino-Nepalese relations from the early 1960s onwards, when they signed the border agreement, when they established diplomatic relations between the two countries. And India was so concerned at that time about it, if you read the archives. So this has been an ongoing matter. The Chinese presence and the Chinese expansion of influence in Nepal. And today, with the kind of economic heft, how it translates into influence for China, Nepal has become a playground for that.
Let's come to the boundary question, Ambassador Rao. This remains as one of the major challenges for India and China. Why have the two sides not been able to finalize a deal on the boundary question? I'm told people say that we know what to do, both sides know what to do, what give and take needs to be done. But why is that the two political leaders, and they are very strong political leaders at this point of time, Mr. Xi and Mr. Modi, why have they not been able to make a final deal on the boundary question?
Whatever be the case, I mean, if and when you have a solution to the boundary question, the settlement, it has to be a political level settlement, and it has to involve a degree of give and take between the two sides. And I think neither side is willing at this moment for that give and take. And it has nothing to do with just now. It has been like that probably from the beginning, except that there is an impression, there is a kind of a persistent view that maybe the Chinese were ready for a swap in the 1950s, when Premier Chou En-lai and Prime Minister Nehru had their confabulations. Right. But when push comes to shove, we really don't know how the Chinese would have reacted, if we had really had to sign on the dotted line on a deal that involved that kind of quote-unquote swap. We were not ready for it at that time. We were not prepared because the whole build-up of the public perception of what this boundary problem involved was centered very much at that time on the Aksai Chin area in Ladakh and the Chinese occupation, the Chinese aggression into that area. The eastern sector of the border, which is defined by the McMahon line, what is today Arunachal Pradesh, we knew, of course, that the Chinese had questions about the McMahon line, but the impression at that time was that they were somehow prepared to accept the realities there. They didn't want to disturb what had come about post, soon after independence, or liberation, what the status was. I think views were still being formed at that stage. But 30 years down the line, by 1985, the Chinese had made it very clear that the eastern sector, the Arunachal Pradesh sector, was the sector of the largest dispute, and that India would have to make concessions there if China was being asked to make concessions in the western sector. So, for the last 34 years, that's where it has stood.
So what was the nature of the conversations when you were the Foreign Secretary and before that when you were the Ambassador to China? Was there the broad contours of a deal that we could have worked out?
I really can't say, and I don't think it would be fair for me to say that a contours of the deal had. Many ideas have been floated, and this is a problem that has been discussed threadbare outside the government also. I think there numerous theories have been floated, but the point is that let's take India, a democracy, constitutionally defined limits, our maps are all in place. You can't really alter boundaries so easily. No government can do it, especially a democratically elected government. So when you're thinking of a border settlement, you must understand why it's taken so long is that it is so complicated and so complex. So the best way is to build confidence between the two sides to ensure that problems don't get out of hand. And that's how you have all the 6-7 confidence building agreements that have ensued since 1992-93. And that has kept the peace on the border, which I think is no mean achievement. But the lack of a boundary settlement certainly, I think, is there. It's at the heart of the relationship, it's at the core of the relationship. And we've tried to build structures around it. We've tried to sort of kind of quarantine it. But how long do we keep it in quarantine is the question.
Ambassador, where do you stand on the BRI, on the Belt and Road Initiative and on CPEC? There are people who are supporting this initiative both in India and in other places, and there are people who are critiquing these initiatives. Where do you stand?
Well, I see it as from the Indian perspective that while, as developing nations, all of us, I don't think anybody opposes connectivity.
Right.
Now,
and we need more of that in South Asia.
We need more of that, and we don't have it today. Absolutely. I could speak for hours about the lack of connectivity. While South Asia is meant to be an integer, as Lakshman Kadirgamar said long ago, we're meant to be. And when do we get to that stage? But that's another production, as it were. But this production, the BRI, well, it is an expression, it's an index of growing Chinese power and influence. It's the way that they moved from the Deng Xiaoping lie low, take low profile to this we will be leaders. That's the President Xi line. He has completely reversed the Deng Xiaoping line. And this is really a sign, evidence of Chinese advance, as it were. And when I use the word advance, strategic advance, economic advance, perhaps at one stage it could translate into military advance also. Who knows? I mean, if a place like Hambantota, although the Sri Lankans would, deny vociferously that there's nothing military about it, but at some stage...
And that it was offered to India in the first place.
That's true. So positions change. No nation's position is static on any issue. That's something I've learned from 40 years in diplomacy. So tomorrow you don't know how China is going to use these assets it has created in the BRI. And with the decline and the, in a sense, a waning of American power in our region, China is really moving into that primus inter pares kind of situation. So this becomes, part of the assets. I hate to use the word ammunition, but in its control. So, and CPEC is a complicating factor for us because it goes through territory which we say belongs to us and which the Pakistanis now occupy. And where the Chinese, if you went by the China-Pakistan, so-called China-Pakistan boundary agreement of 1963, they gave the impression that everything would be settled really in due time and space once India and Pakistan had settled their problems on Kashmir. And that has been thrown out the window now because they have gone ahead and built the road. You recall 6-7 years ago when the World Bank wanted to do projects in Arunachal Pradesh. Who were the biggest protesters? The Chinese. So they can't turn round at us and preach about the need for India to.
So in other words, you're saying that once these assets are created in the region, the benign, so-called benign intentions could change, capabilities remain. So once these capabilities are there, in a future Chinese government may have a different intention altogether. And that's a challenge for us.
Yes, we all know from childhood that the dragon is a fire-breathing animal.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.